The scorching California sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah Mitchell stepped through the gates of Edwards Air Force Base, her worn military surplus jacket hanging loose over a simple white shirt. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail and thick-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. In her hands, she clutched only a weathered notebook, not the sleek tablets and laptops the other officers carried like badges of honor. The massive hangar buzzed with activity as uniformed personnel moved with purpose between gleaming aircraft and sophisticated equipment. Sarah had dreamed of this moment for years, but as she walked deeper into the facility, the conversations around her gradually died down. Officers paused mid-sentence, their eyes following her movement with undisguised curiosity and barely concealed disdain. "Hey there, sweetheart," called out Major Kevin Ellis, a tall man with perfectly pressed uniforms and polished flight boots. His voice carried across the hangar with theatrical loudness. "You lost? The visitor center is back that way." His comment drew snickers from a cluster of flight veterans behind him, their ranks gleaming in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Maybe she's here to show us how to organize our flight manuals," added Colonel Richard Hastings dryly, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals. The laughter that followed felt like ice water in Sarah's veins, but she kept walking, her chin tilted just slightly upward, not in defiance, but in quiet dignity. Sarah had come to Edwards for the B-52 Stratofortress pilot training program, having received an official invitation after years of distinguished service in classified operations. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "True strength doesn't need to announce itself, Sarah. It reveals itself through action, not words." As she approached the main desk, Colonel Hastings stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow over her.
"I don't see any rank insignia, Miss Mitchell. Where's your assignment paperwork? Who authorized your presence here?"
His tone suggested he already doubted her legitimacy. Sarah pulled out her official orders and handed them over. Hastings studied the documents with obvious skepticism, his eyebrows rising higher with each line. "This says you're here for advanced
"Strategic bomber training," he said with a derisive laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a comedian." Several officers exchanged glances, their amusement barely contained as Hastings handed back her papers with 2 fingers, as if
touching something distasteful. "Look, there must be some mistake. We run advanced training here, strategic operations, nuclear protocols. We don't do recreational flights for wannabes who barely know how to read an instrument panel." Sarah stood her ground, pointing to the signature at the bottom of her orders. "General Patricia Marshall, head of Strategic Air Command," she said quietly. The name carried weight, and she saw Hastings' confident smile falter momentarily. "Well, General Marshall isn't here, is she?" He recovered quickly. "I am, and I say there's no place for you in this program." As the group of men closed ranks around their commander, Sarah spotted another woman, Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez, in uniform near the communications station. Rodriguez gave her a quick, sympathetic glance before looking away. So there were other women here, but they had clearly learned to keep their heads down and blend into the background. The assessment was brutal and immediate. Major Ellis tapped, his pen against a clipboard as he spoke. "We've reviewed your file, Mitchell. It's practically empty. Aside from some vague notation about a 2012 Greenland exercise, there's no substantial record, no verified flight hours, no digital training records, no advanced simulator performance under official supervision." Another officer chimed in. "That means documented flight logs, electronic service records, and measurable achievements. You've got none of the prerequisites." As they continued to dissect her qualifications, or apparent lack thereof, Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, pressing down like a physical force, But beneath their scrutiny, something else was forming, a quiet determination that would soon shake the very foundations of their arrogance. She had spent years in the shadows, her achievements classified, and her service record deliberately obscured. For national security reasons, these men saw only what they were allowed to see. A blank slate they assumed meant incompetence. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most skilled pilots in the Air Force, someone whose expertise had been deliberately hidden to protect sensitive operations. The battle lines were being drawn, and Sarah Mitchell was about to prove that still waters run deeper than anyone imagined. The systematic exclusion. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the briefing room 15 minutes early, notebook in hand. She chose a seat in the back, hoping to observe and learn the dynamics before fully engaging. One by one, the other trainees filed in, all men, all wearing crisp uniforms adorned with various insignia that told stories of their accomplishments and connections. Major Ellis entered last, his eyes immediately scanning the room until they landed on Sarah with unmistakable satisfaction. Well, looks like our mystery guest decided to join us after all, he announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ms. Mitchell, since you're so interested in our advanced training program, perhaps you'd like to share your expertise with the class. All heads turned toward her. Some faces showed smirks, others curiosity, but none showed respect. I'm here to learn, Major, Sarah replied evenly, just like everyone else. Ellis's smile tightened into something predatory. Oh, but surely someone with your unique background has some special insights to offer. He paused, letting the silence build. No, then perhaps you can enlighten us about the proper emergency procedure for hydraulic failure in a B-52 at high altitude. It was a trap, a technical question designed to humiliate her in front of the group. But Sarah had spent countless hours studying these aircraft, driven by a passion that went far beyond mere duty. Full power to remaining engines, maintain level flight, engage backup hydraulic systems 1 through 3 in sequence, maintain minimum altitude of 10,000 feet, prepare for manual control of all flight surfaces, she answered without hesitation, her voice steady and confident. The room fell dead silent. Ellis's predatory smile vanished entirely. Textbook answer, he snapped, his composure cracking slightly. But flying isn't about memorizing manuals, Mitchell. It's about experience, instinct, and split-second decisions under pressure, things you can't learn sitting in a library. For the remainder of the session, Ellis pointedly ignored her raised hand whenever questions were posed to the group. When he distributed the day's simulation assignments, he deliberately passed her desk without leaving any materials. Excuse.
Me, Major, Sarah said as the other trainees began filing out. I didn't receive my assignment. Ellis turned slowly, his expression cold. That's correct, Ms. Mitchell. You'll be observing today. We wouldn't want to rush you into anything too technical.
Laughter rippled through the remaining trainees as they gathered their materials. During lunch, Sarah sat alone in the cafeteria, the empty chairs around her table creating an invisible barrier. She noticed Lieutenant Rodriguez hesitate near her table before ultimately settling with the other officers across the room. The isolation was deliberate and complete. A shadow fell across her table as Colonel Hastings approached, coffee mug in hand. I understand Major Ellis has you observing today, he said, his tone falsely conversational. Yes, sir. Smart move. Walk before you run, as they say. He paused, studying her with calculating eyes. You know, there's no shame in recognizing when you're out of your depth, Mitchell. We have administrative positions that might be more appropriate for someone with your qualifications. I appreciate your concern, Colonel, but I'm here for pilot training." His expression hardened instantly. "Let me be frank, Miss Mitchell. This program has never had a female complete it successfully. Not because women aren't allowed, but because none have met our standards. We don't adjust requirements for anyone." "I'm not asking for adjustments, sir." "Good, because you won't get any." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I've seen your type before, idealists with something to prove. They usually wash out within the first week, often in spectacular fashion." As he walked away, Sarah noticed several officers watching the exchange, their expressions mixing pity with satisfaction. One muttered something that made the others laugh. She couldn't hear the words, but the mockery was unmistakable. That afternoon brought her first real test. While the other trainees were assigned various training modules, Sarah was relegated to reviewing basic flight manuals that she had mastered years ago. The message was clear: they would keep her busy with meaningless tasks while excluding her from actual training. But Sarah had faced worse challenges than bruised egos and petty power games. As she sat alone with her worn notebook, she began documenting everything, every slight, every deviation from standard protocol, every instance of unprofessional conduct. If they wanted to play games, she would be ready. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to be intimidated by small-minded men who confused tradition with competence. The breaking point: by the end of the first week, Sarah's isolation had become absolute. The other trainees avoided her during meals and briefings as if her presence might contaminate their standing with the instructors. When group assignments were distributed, she was consistently the odd one out, forced to work alone or simply observe while others participated in hands-on training. Major Ellis had escalated from simple exclusion to active sabotage. During her first actual simulator session, he programmed a scenario so complex that even veteran pilots would struggle. The parameters were far beyond standard training protocols, designed not to educate, but to humiliate. When Sarah managed to keep the virtual aircraft stable for nearly 6 minutes, longer than anyone had expected, Ellis abruptly terminated the simulation. "Time's up. Scenario failed," he announced to the observers, his voice carrying false authority. Ms. Mitchell's aircraft experienced catastrophic decompression at altitude, all souls lost, but the parameters were stabilizing. Sarah protested, pointing to the readouts on her console. The aircraft was recovering? "In your opinion," Ellis replied coldly. "Unfortunately, your opinion doesn't align with standard operational assessment procedures." Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the simulation from the communications station, frowned slightly but remained silent. The unspoken message was clear: challenging Ellis would only invite his wrath upon herself. That afternoon, Sarah discovered her personal locker had been reassigned. Her belongings sat in a cardboard box outside the women's restroom, accompanied by a note: "Space needed for qualified personnel." When she brought this to Colonel Hastings' attention, he barely looked up from his paperwork. "Space is limited, Ms. Mitchell. Since you're not officially ranked within our program structure, you're lowest priority for facility usage." "I have the same official clearance as everyone else in the program," she pointed out. "On paper, perhaps." His smile was as cold as winter wind. "I suggest you keep your materials with you or store them in your quarters." The breaking point came during a technical briefing on emergency procedures. Sarah noticed a critical error in the instructor's explanation about fuel management during engine failure, a mistake that could prove fatal in real-world situations. When she raised her hand to ask a clarifying question, the room fell silent with an uncomfortable tension. "Yes, Miss Mitchell," the instructor said, making her name sound like profanity. "Sir, wouldn't venting fuel from the affected wing tank create a dangerous imbalance that could actually worsen the emergency situation. Several officers exchanged
uncomfortable glances. She was absolutely right, and they knew it. The instructor's face flushed with embarrassment and anger.
That's a theoretical concern, only relevant in extreme edge cases, which we are not discussing in this basic overview. After the briefing, as Sarah gathered her notes with hands that trembled slightly from controlled rage, Lieutenant Rodriguez approached cautiously. "You were right about the fuel venting procedure," she said quietly, glancing around nervously. "That technique was revised 2 years ago after a near-fatal incident in Colorado." "Thank you," Sarah replied, surprised by this unexpected acknowledgement. Rodriguez hesitated, clearly wrestling with her conscience. "Look, I should warn you about something. They've scheduled you for the nightmare scenario tomorrow." Nightmare scenario? It's a simulator program with multiple cascading system failures in a combat environment. It's designed to be unbeatable. They use it to humble pilots who get too confident. She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "No
one has ever completed it successfully. It's not meant to be completed."
Before Sarah could respond, Major Ellis appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he saw them talking. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, I believe you're needed in the operations room immediately." Rodriguez straightened. "Yes, sir." She gave Sarah an apologetic look before hurrying away. Ellis turned his attention to Sarah, his smile predatory and triumphant. "Fraternizing with my officers, Miss Mitchell?" "Just discussing the technical briefing, Major." "Of course." His expression made it clear he didn't believe her. "Looking forward to seeing your performance tomorrow. It should be quite enlightening for everyone involved." As he walked away, Sarah realized the stakes had been raised dramatically. They weren't just trying to discourage her anymore, they were setting her up for a humiliating public failure that would justify removing her from the program entirely. But they had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated who they were dealing with. The impossible test. The nightmare scenario drew an unprecedented crowd. Officers who normally paid little attention to routine simulator drills suddenly found compelling reasons to be in the observation area. Some made no attempt to hide their anticipation of Sarah's failure, exchanging knowing smirks and barely suppressed chuckles as she entered the simulator pod. Major Ellis stood at the control console with Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Summers, both men speaking in low conspiratorial tones while occasionally glancing towards Sarah with cold satisfaction. "Standard parameters not challenging enough, Ellis?" Colonel Hastings asked as he joined them, his tone suggesting he was in on whatever they had planned. "Just ensuring Ms. Mitchell gets the full experience, sir," Ellis replied smoothly. "After all, we wouldn't want to be accused of going easy on her." Hastings studied the monitor displaying the scenario parameters. 4 simultaneous system failures, plus enemy fire and severe weather conditions. He raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious?" "She claims exceptional competence," Summers interjected with a smirk. "Let's see her prove it." Sarah settled into the simulators, pilot seat, methodically fastening her harness and adjusting the controls to her preferences. Through the observation window, she could see at least 20 officers gathered, more than had ever attended a routine training exercise. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood at the back of the group, her expression deeply troubled. "Commencing nightmare scenario in 3, 2, 1, Ellis's voice came through the intercom, a note of barely contained anticipation evident in his tone. The simulation began with routine flight parameters, standard altitude, clear weather, all systems functioning normally. Then suddenly warning alarms began blaring as multiple systems failed simultaneously. The virtual B-52 shuddered violently as 2 engines flamed out in quick succession. Enemy fire appeared on the radar display. critical hydraulic systems went
offline. The co-pilot's instrument panel went completely dark. Hostile territory, Ellis narrated for the benefit of the audience, his voice taking on the tone of a sports commentator calling a boxing match.
No backup support, no rescue options available. Sarah's hands flew across the controls with practiced precision, prioritizing critical systems in order of importance. She rerouted power to compensate for the failed engines and managed to stabilize the aircraft momentarily. Then Ellis added another devastating parameter, catastrophic fuel leak from the port wing tank. The virtual bomber began to dive as fuel streamed away, taking with it any hope of reaching friendly territory. Gasps came from the observation area as the simulator tilted sharply, mimicking the sensation of an uncontrolled descent. By all standard protocols, this was now an unrecoverable situation. The test had transformed from whether she could save the aircraft to how long she could delay the inevitable crash. It wasn't training, it was a public execution. Sweat beaded on Sarah's forehead as she fought with increasingly unresponsive controls. 3 minutes passed, longer than anyone had lasted in this scenario. Then 4. The officers in the observation area had stopped their casual chatter, their attention now completely focused on the impossible sight before them. At 5 minutes, Ellis frowned and added atmospheric turbulence to the already overwhelming list of failures. Still, Sarah kept the bomber airborne, using techniques that weren't documented in any manual, adjustments and workarounds she had learned through years of practical experience in situations these men could only imagine. At 7 minutes, Ellis exchanged a worried glance with Summers. This wasn't going according to their carefully laid plan. He reached for the console to add another failure, complete navigation system blackout. Scenario parameters now exceed maximum difficulty levels, the computer announced with mechanical indifference, its programming struggling to process the unprecedented combination of failures. Sarah focused entirely on the feel of the aircraft. Ignoring the screaming alarms and flashing warning lights that filled the cockpit, she was no longer flying by instruments, she was flying by instinct, by experience, by skills honed in real-world situations where failure meant death. Gradually, impossibly, she managed to level out the dive and establish a glide path that might, just might, allow for an emergency landing at a distant airfield shown on the tactical display. Ellis had seen enough. His hand moved toward the emergency stop button, ready to end this embarrassing demonstration of his own incompetence. "Wait!" Colonel Hastings said sharply, his eyes fixed on the readouts. "Let's see this through to completion." 8 minutes. Into the scenario, a scenario designed to be survived for no more than 2 minutes, Sarah brought the crippled bomber into final approach alignment with the virtual runway. Against all odds, against protocols that declared such a landing physically impossible, she eased the massive aircraft down with the skill of someone who had performed similar miracles in the real world. There was a moment of absolute stunned silence as the computer announced in its emotionless voice, "Scenario complete.
Emergency landing successful. Crew survival 100%. When Sarah emerged from the simulator, she expected at least grudging acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. Instead, she found stony faces and carefully averted eyes. "System
Malfunction," Ellis announced loudly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Scenario parameters were corrupted, results invalid." "That's not true," Lieutenant Rodriguez protested, stepping forward despite the obvious risk to her career. "The system functioned perfectly. She completed the scenario." "That's enough, Lieutenant," Hastings snapped. "Major Ellis has determined the test was compromised due to technical difficulties." Sarah stood among the hostile faces, finally understanding. with crystal clarity that no accomplishment, no demonstration of skill would ever be sufficient. The rules would simply change to ensure her failure because her success threatened the very foundation of their prejudices. "You know what I accomplished in there," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You all know exactly what happened." "What we know," Ellis replied coldly, "is that you don't belong here. Never have, never will. Why don't you save yourself further embarrassment and resign from the program?" As the officers filed out, some laughing openly at what they saw as her desperate attempt to claim victory from obvious defeat, Sarah felt something inside her shift. Not her spirit, that remained unbroken, but her patience had finally reached its end. The war was about to begin in earnest. Gathering evidence. That night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, her mind racing as she analyzed her options with the methodical precision that had made her one of the Air Force's most effective pilots. Quitting wasn't even a consideration. She had faced far worse odds in classified operations that these men would never know about. Filing an official complaint through normal channels would likely disappear into the same system that was protecting Ellis and Hastings. A soft knock at her door interrupted her strategic planning. She opened it to find Lieutenant Rodriguez standing in the hallway, glancing nervously in both directions before stepping inside. "What they did today was wrong," Rodriguez said without preamble, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "The entire command staff witnessed you complete that scenario, and now they're covering it up." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, studying the younger woman's face. "Because I've been where you are," Rodriguez replied, her composure cracking slightly. "When I arrived 3 years ago, they used the same tactics. Not as blatantly, perhaps, but the same systematic exclusion, the same questioning of qualifications, the same impossible standards. What did you do? I chose to keep my head down, play by their rules, survive by becoming invisible." Rodriguez's voice carried deep regret. "I made it through the program, but at what cost? I watched them drive out 2 other qualified women before you arrived. I said nothing. Did nothing." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. "I pulled these files from the system before Ellis could delete them. Complete data recording from your simulator run, every parameter, every input, every system response. Proof that you not only completed the scenario, but did it using techniques none of us have seen before." Sarah stared at the device, understanding its significance. "Thank you, but what good does this do? They'll just claim it's been tampered with." "Maybe," Rodriguez admitted. "But there's more." She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning, General Marshall is making an unannounced inspection visit to review the entire program. Ellis and Hastings don't know yet. General
Marshall? Sarah's pulse quickened. The same officer who signed my assignment orders? The very same.
She personally recommended you for this program based on classified service records that most people here don't have clearance to access." Rodriguez moved toward the door, then paused. "I can't be seen here any longer, but be ready tomorrow. This could be your chance." After Rodriguez left, Sarah spent the next several hours reviewing everything she knew about General Marshall, her reputation for fairness, her intolerance for discrimination, and most importantly, her access to Sarah's complete unredacted service record. For the first time since arriving at Edwards, Sarah felt a spark of genuine hope. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hangar earlier than usual. Instead of her typical notebook, she carried a military-grade tablet, a device she rarely used, preferring paper and pen. Today, however, she needed its technical capabilities for what she was planning. She approached Sergeant William Miller, the maintenance chief who had largely remained neutral during the officer's treatment of her. "Sergeant, I need access to the simulator diagnostic panel." Miller eyed her suspiciously. "That's restricted to authorized maintenance personnel only, ma'am." "I understand, but I believe there may be calibration issues affecting training outcomes." She kept her voice professional and calm. "If you check yesterday's session logs, you'll find some highly irregular readings that could indicate system problems." Miller hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and curiosity. Finally, he shrugged. 5 minutes, that's all you get." It was more than enough. Sarah connected her tablet to the diagnostic port and downloaded the complete system logs, including Ellis's unauthorized parameter modifications and the override codes he had used to invalidate her successful completion. The evidence was all there, digital proof of deliberate sabotage. As she finished, the hangar doors opened and officers began scrambling to attention. General Patricia Marshall had arrived ahead of schedule, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she moved through the facility with purposeful stride. Colonel Hastings hurried to keep pace beside her, clearly caught off guard by the early arrival. As they passed through the hangar, Marshall's sharp eyes briefly met Sarah's. There was no recognition in her expression, but Sarah sensed she had been noticed and catalogued. In the confusion of the General's unexpected arrival, Sarah made her way to the simulator control room. With everyone focused on Marshall's inspection, she had precious minutes alone with the system. She uploaded Rodriguez's recording of her successful nightmare scenario run, then connected it seamlessly to the diagnostic logs showing Ellis's illegal manipulations. Finally, she programmed the system to display this evidence automatically when a specific command sequence was entered, a sequence only she would know. The trap was set. As she finished, Major Ellis appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and suspicion. "What are you doing in here, Mitchell?" Sarah turned calmly to face him. "Preparing for today's training, Major. I believe General Marshall wants to observe all trainees in action." Ellis's complexion paled slightly. "General Marshall is here for a routine administrative inspection. She won't have time for individual demonstrations." "We'll see," Sarah replied, walking past him with newfound confidence. The tide was about to turn, and she intended to be ready when it did. The reckoning General Marshall's inspection proceeded with military precision throughout the morning. She reviewed facilities, examined maintenance records, and observed routine operations with the sharp eye of someone who had built her career on attention to detail. Her expression revealed nothing as Colonel Hastings guided her through a carefully choreographed tour, but Sarah noticed how he steered the general away from certain areas, particularly the simulator bay where the most questionable activities had occurred. Major Ellis shadowed them throughout, interjecting with carefully prepared statistics about the program's success rates and glowing testimonials about training effectiveness. His confidence had returned now that he believed the evidence of his sabotage was safely deleted. During the mid-morning briefing with all officers present, Marshall finally addressed what everyone knew she had come to investigate. "Colonel Hastings," she said, her voice conversational but her eyes laser-focused, "I understand you have a civilian consultant participating in this training cycle." Hastings cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ah, yes, ma'am, Ms. Mitchell. A somewhat unconventional addition to our program. Her participation has been primarily observational, given certain qualification gaps." "I'd like to see her in action," Marshall stated flatly. "With respect, General, civilian consultants aren't held to the same rigorous standards as our regular military trainees. Her involvement has been largely academic in nature." "Actually, sir," Lieutenant Rodriguez interjected from her position at the communications console. Ms. Mitchell completed our most advanced simulator scenario yesterday. Perhaps the General would like to review those results. Ellis stepped forward, quickly, shooting Rodriguez a warning glare. Unfortunately, that session experienced significant technical difficulties. The data was corrupted and unusable. Interesting, Marshall replied, her tone suggesting she found Ellis's explanation anything but convincing. I'd still like to see Ms. Mitchell demonstrate her capabilities. Now, in fact, the color drained from Ellis's face. Of course, ma'am, we'll set up a standard evaluation scenario appropriate for her experience level. No, Marshall said firmly, her command voice cutting through any possibility of misunderstanding.
I want to see this nightmare scenario I've been hearing so much about, the one that's supposedly unbeatable. Hastings and Ellis exchanged panicked glances, realizing their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. Ma'am, that scenario
is extremely advanced. It would be unfair to expect a civilian consultant to— I didn't ask for your assessment, Colonel, Marshall interrupted coldly. I gave you a direct order. The simulator room filled quickly as words spread through the base. Officers lined the walls, their earlier mockery replaced by tense anticipation. Ellis reluctantly took his position at the control console, while Marshall positioned herself directly behind him, close enough to observe every adjustment and modification. Standard parameters, Major, Marshall instructed, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. No unauthorized modifications. Sarah entered the simulator with calm determination, her movements precise and confident. As the scenario began loading, she caught Ellis attempting to adjust settings when he thought no one was looking. Before we begin, she said clearly over the intercom system, I'd like to request that Lieutenant Rodriguez verify the scenario parameters match standard protocols. Ellis froze, his hand hovering over the control interface. Marshall nodded approvingly. Excellent suggestion. Lieutenant Rodriguez, please confirm all parameters. Rodriguez stepped forward and examined the console carefully. Major Ellis has increased difficulty factors by approximately 30% above standard protocols, ma'am. Reset to standard parameters immediately, Marshall ordered, her voice dangerously quiet. The scenario began, and once again, Sarah found herself piloting a virtual B-52 through cascading system failures and hostile territory. This time, however, the parameters remained consistent, challenging but not impossible, designed to test skill rather than ensure failure. She navigated the crisis with methodical precision, demonstrating techniques that had officers murmuring among themselves in growing amazement. When she successfully completed the emergency landing after 8 minutes of intense flying, the room was completely silent. Marshall turned to Ellis, her expression unreadable. Impressive performance, wouldn't you agree, Major? Ellis nodded stiffly, sweat beading on his forehead. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about yesterday's attempt, Marshall continued with deadly calm. You mentioned the data was corrupted. That's correct, General. Sarah stepped forward. General Marshall, with your permission, I'd like to access the simulator's
diagnostic system. At Marshall's nod, Sarah approached the console and entered the command sequence she had programmed earlier. The main display screen filled with split-screen data, side-by-side footage of both attempts, parameter logs clearly showing Ellis's unauthorized modifications, and system records proving beyond doubt that her first attempt had been successfully completed. The evidence was undeniable and damning. It appears, Marshall said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade, that the only corruption was in the reporting of results. She turned to face Hastings and Ellis directly. Colonel, Major, I'd like to see you both in private.
Immediately. As they filed out of the room, the The remaining officers looked at Sarah with completely transformed expressions, some showing newfound respect.
Others barely concealed resentment at having their comfortable system of prejudice challenged and exposed. Either way, Sarah Mitchell was no longer invisible. Justice served, General Marshall called an all-hands meeting in the main hangar that afternoon. Officers lined up in precise formation, the tension in the air so thick it seemed to press against everyone like a physical weight. Colonel Hastings and Major Ellis stood off to the side, their faces rigid masks barely concealing their fury and humiliation at being exposed. Marshall strode to the center of the assembled formation, her bearing commanding absolute attention as she surveyed the personnel before speaking. "Since its inception," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the vast space, "the Strategic Bomber Training Program has prided itself on maintaining the highest standards of excellence in military aviation. Those standards encompass not just technical proficiency, but integrity, leadership, and the wisdom to recognize exceptional talent regardless of its source." Her gaze swept across the ranks, lingering on specific officers who had been most vocal in their persecution of Sarah. "This morning I witnessed something deeply disturbing, not merely the deliberate sabotage of a trainee's evaluation, but a systematic campaign to exclude a highly qualified individual from a program to which she was rightfully assigned." Murmurs rippled through the formation until Marshall raised her hand for silence. "Ms. Mitchell, please step forward." Sarah moved to stand beside the general, her posture straight and her expression composed, despite the dozens of eyes focused on her. She had faced hostile fire in combat zones. She could certainly handle hostile stares in a hangar. "For those unaware," Marshall continued, "Sarah Mitchell is not simply a civilian consultant seeking adventure. In 2014, during joint NATO exercises in Greenland, Lieutenant Mitchell successfully landed a heavily damaged B-52 in zero visibility. Conditions after both the pilot and co-pilot were incapacitated by a bird strike that shattered the cockpit. Shocked whispers spread through the assembled personnel. Lieutenant Rodriguez's eyes widened with sudden understanding. She had heard rumors about the Greenland incident, but never connected it to the quiet woman who had endured weeks of harassment. "Following that incident," Marshall continued, "Lieutenant Mitchell was recruited for highly classified missions requiring her unique combination of technical expertise and unshakable composure under extreme pressure. Her complete service record was compartmentalized for national security reasons, a fact that certain officers in this program exploited to question her qualifications and justify their discriminatory behavior." The general's voice hardened as she turned to face Hastings and Ellis directly. "Colonel Hastings, your leadership has fostered an environment where talent is judged not by merit, but by conformity to narrow-minded prejudices. Major Ellis, your deliberate sabotage of training scenarios and falsification of official records constitute serious violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Ellis stepped forward, his face flushed with desperate defiance. "Ma'am, with all due respect, our methods have maintained program standards for over a decade. We cannot afford to lower our requirements to accommodate—" "Lower requirements?" Marshall cut him off sharply. "Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated piloting skills that exceed those of your most senior instructors. She completed a scenario specifically designed to be impossible twice. Your concern was never about maintaining—"
"Standards, Major. It was about protecting your own fragile sense of superiority." The general turned back to address the full assembly.
"Effective immediately, Colonel Hastings is relieved of command pending a full investigation into discriminatory practices within this program. Major Ellis is suspended from all instructional duties and will face formal charges under the UCMJ." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the stunned officers. "Lieutenant Rodriguez will assume temporary oversight of daily operations until a permanent replacement commander arrives." Rodriguez straightened in surprise as her name was called, clearly not expecting to be thrust into such a position of responsibility as, "For Ms. Mitchell," Marshall continued, "her commission is hereby reactivated at the rank of Major with appropriate adjustments for time served in classified operations. She will be joining this program not as a trainee, but as the new Director of Emergency Procedures and Advanced Systems Training." The hangar fell into absolute silence as the full implications of this announcement sank in. The woman they had mocked and marginalized was now going to be in a position of authority over many of them. Marshall faced Sarah directly. "Major Mitchell, do you accept this assignment?" Sarah considered the offer, thinking of all the qualified individuals who might face similar treatment in the future. "I do, ma'am." "Outstanding." Marshall turned her attention back to the assembled officers. "Some of you actively participated in the mistreatment of a fellow service member. Others stood by and said nothing while discrimination occurred in your presence. Both represent failures of character that I expect to see immediately corrected." Her final words carried the weight of absolute command authority. "Major Mitchell has demonstrated more integrity and professionalism in 2 weeks than some of you have shown in your entire careers. I strongly suggest you learn from her example." As Marshall concluded the meeting, the message was unmistakably clear. The old guard had fallen, and a new era of accountability had begun at Edwards Air Force Base. Full circle. 3 months later, Edwards Air Force Base operated under a completely transformed atmosphere. The investigation into Hastings and Ellis had uncovered a disturbing pattern of discrimination extending far beyond Sarah's case. At least 6 other qualified candidates, including 3 women and 2 minority officers, had been systematically excluded or driven out over the past 5 years. Several officers had been reassigned to less prestigious positions or opted for early retirement rather than face formal charges. Others, recognizing which way the institutional wind was blowing, had genuinely adjusted their attitudes and discovered that diversity actually strengthened their programs rather than weakening them. Major Sarah Mitchell had established a comprehensive emergency procedures training program that quickly became the gold standard for the entire Air Force. Her methods, once dismissed as outdated, were now recognized as essential backup protocols when advanced digital systems failed under combat.
Stress.
The analog approach, as trainees called it, had already saved lives in 3 separate overseas incidents. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, promoted for her integrity during the crisis, worked closely with Sarah to completely overhaul simulator training protocols. Together they ensured that evaluations focused on actual piloting competence rather than political conformity or adherence to arbitrary social hierarchies. One crisp morning, as Sarah reviewed training schedules in her new office, the same space that had once belonged to Colonel Hastings, there was a hesitant knock at her door. She looked up to see Kevin Ellis standing in the doorway, no longer wearing the uniform that had once been his badge of authority. "Major Mitchell," he said stiffly, his civilian clothes looking somehow diminished compared to the military bearing-up he had once projected. "May I speak with you?" Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, curious about what had brought her former tormentor to seek this meeting. "Of course. Please, sit down." Ellis settled uncomfortably into the chair, his posture reflecting someone who had lost more than just his rank. "I've been offered a consulting position with Lockheed Martin. Before I accept, I wanted to clear the air between us." "I'm listening," Sarah replied simply. "What I did was wrong," he said bluntly, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "Not just unprofessional, but fundamentally wrong."
I was, he struggled to find the right words. "Threatened by you, by what you represented. Someone who didn't fit the narrow mold I thought was essential for military excellence." Sarah studied him carefully, seeing for the first time not
arrogance but genuine remorse mixed with painful self-awareness. The mold isn't what makes a good pilot, Kevin. It's what's inside: judgment, adaptability, the ability to stay calm when everything is falling apart. I know that now, he admitted quietly. I should have known it then. He hesitated, then continued. Your emergency protocols saved a crew in Afghanistan last week. Captain Williams, he trained under your new program. When their B-52 lost all electronic systems over hostile territory, he used your manual override techniques to bring them home safely. Sarah felt a warm surge of satisfaction, though she hadn't heard about this particular incident. I'm glad the training helped. That's why we do this work. Ellis stood to leave, then paused at the door. For whatever it's worth, Sarah, I'm genuinely sorry, not just for the career consequences I faced, but for the person I was. You deserved better. Apology accepted, Sarah replied simply. Good luck with the consulting work. After he left, Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with a tablet and an expression of barely contained excitement. Was that really Ellis I saw leaving? It was, Sarah confirmed. People can change, Jennifer. Sometimes it just takes losing everything to realize what they should have valued all along. Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. Some people only learn through consequences. Others never learn at all. She brightened, holding up her tablet. Speaking of learning, the new trainee class has arrived. 15 candidates, including 5 women and our first openly transgender pilot. They're waiting in the briefing room. Sarah gathered her materials and headed for the door, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with each new group of aspiring pilots. In the hallway, she passed what had once been Colonel Hastings' office, now occupied by Colonel Angela Martinez, the new base commander. Through the open door, she caught Martinez's eye and received a respectful nod of acknowledgement. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as 15 fresh-faced trainees stood at attention, their eyes following Sarah as she walked to the front of the room. She could see them taking in her simple uniform with the major's insignia she had finally reclaimed, noting that their primary instructor was someone who looked more like a librarian than a combat pilot. At ease, she said, watching as they relaxed slightly. Welcome to Advanced Strategic Bomber Training. My name is Major Mitchell. She noticed the women trainees exchanging subtle glances of amazement and hope at seeing a female officer in charge of their training. One young lieutenant's eyes were particularly bright with determination. Her name tag read Thompson, and something in her expression reminded Sarah of her own younger self. Some of you may have heard stories about this program, Sarah continued, placing her worn notebook on the podium, the same notebook that had once been mocked but now represented something deeper. Stories about how it was once an old boys' club, how certain people weren't welcome, how the system was rigged against anyone who didn't fit a particular image. She looked at each trainee in turn, seeing in their faces the future of military aviation. Those stories are true, but they're also history. This program isn't about proving yourself to others anymore. It's about mastering yourself and your aircraft. It's about understanding that sometimes the oldest, simplest techniques are the ones that will save your life when all the fancy technology fails. Lieutenant Thompson raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, what's the most important thing we need to know to succeed here? Sarah smiled, remembering her father's words from so many years ago. True competence doesn't need to announce itself, Thompson. It reveals itself through quiet confidence and consistent performance. Your job isn't to be the loudest voice in the room, it's to be the most reliable pilot in the sky. As the briefing continued, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion wash over her. The system that had once tried to break her had instead been transformed by her persistence and integrity. The very qualities that had made her an outsider, her analytical approach, her refusal to be intimidated, her commitment to excellence over politics, now made her an essential leader. She looked out at the eager faces before her, knowing that some would struggle, some would excel, and all would be judged fairly based on their actual abilities rather than irrelevant demographic characteristics. The young women in the group would face challenges, certainly, but they would face them in an environment committed to their success rather than their failure. The nightmare was over. The dream was just beginning. In her quarters that evening, Sarah opened a letter that had arrived that morning, her father's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he had written just a few lines. "Sarah, I heard about your promotion and your new position. I always knew you had the strength to change, not just your own circumstances, but the system itself. Your mother would be so proud. I certainly am. Remember, true dignity was never about forcing others to accept you. It was about refusing to accept anything less than what you deserved. Well done, my dear, well done." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her notebook, right next to the original orders that had brought her to Edwards Air Force Base. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new trainees to mentor, and new opportunities to ensure that merit triumphed over prejudice. But tonight, Major Sarah Mitchell simply sat in her chair and smiled, knowing that she had not only survived the storm, she had changed the sky itself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.